By the time the tumor was finally out of her, the light in the operating room had shifted from sterile white to the tired amber of late night. My mask had carved two shallow hills into my cheeks. My shoulders ached like someone had tried on the weight of the world and kept it there. 12 hours. 12 hours of scalpels and sutures of watching lines on a monitor become less jagged and then at last flat. I remember thinking as I peeled off my gloves and felt the smell of antiseptic cling to my skin, that all I wanted was the small mercy of oblivion, my own bed, the soft dent I shared with Michael, the humming white noise of the refrigerator we had bickered about buying. I had been on call at Pacific Hills Medical Center for nearly a decade. The night corridors knew me by the cadence of my footsteps. I knew how the ward lights softened at 3 a.m, and how the vending machine in the staff lounge always ate someone's dollar with the particular cruelty of a quiet, persistent machine. That night, everything felt more fragile than usual, as if the world had been sanded down and someone had taken to the edges. The call came from the ER charge nurse while I was in the thin blue fabric of the locker room, tugging at fresh scrubs. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice paper-thin, with the kind of urgency that only comes when a plan has suddenly changed. "We need a consult in the triage area. OB/GYN. Young woman fainted. Companion with head trauma. Could be simple syncope, but we want you to evaluate." I had already stripped off the exhaustion armor and let it drop into the locker. Instinct shoved me back into my white coat. Hospitals do not observe anyone's borders. There is no GPS for grief. We are all addressable at any hour. I tied my hair up, smoothed a hand across the uniform I had ironed in a hurry, and moved. The ER smelled like everything hospitals are built to deny: stale coffee, charged adrenaline disinfectant, pretending not to be what it is. My flashlight of a headlamp clicked, and I cut through the curtains. She was on the gurney, pale and small, against the hospital linen. Her hand clutched to her abdomen. He sat in a chair, one hand to his temple, the other white-knuckled on the vinyl armrest. His jacket was wrinkled hair askew, and he wore the sort of helpless expression that men adopt when they've been forcibly unmade. The first thing that caught the light was a small tag on his dressing gown. The name read Michael Reed. I should have only registered the name. I should have been a professional, detach, assess treat. But my body lied. My heartbeat skipped like a faulty metronome. There was a time when that name made my ribs open like doors. When I married Michael, it was because of the way his laughter contaminated the air and because of the plan we drew on napkins over cheap coffee. A condo in Santa Monica mornings, thick with fog and possibility. My reaction was animal and electric. I froze. Then, absurdly hopeful, I tried to convince myself it must be someone who looked like him. There are lookalikes for everything, including heartbreak. I told myself, "You're tired, Emily. You are in a hospital. Your brain will stitch any stray image into a story. Take a breath. Be a doctor." The curtain slid back, and in the harsh white of the ER, the illusion evaporated. He was unmistakable. The knuckle white of his grip, the slope of his nose. The jacket he wore, the gray silk set I'd given him last Christmas, the one he'd promised to bring on his business trip to San Diego. He wore it like an insult. I made a soundless calculation. Time became a measuring instrument of the smallest order. Seconds to compose myself, breaths to look professional. A dozen clinical questions that would not let me look directly at him. He must have seen the tension in my face. His eyes flicked up and then widened like a man who had unexpectedly caught sight of his own consequence. Surprise, recognition, then panic the way a tide comes in without warning and takes the shore. He tried to speak. Emily, he said a single syllable that pretended to be casual and failed. My voice was not mine. It was clinical distant, designed to blunt and to preserve. Please step back. I need you to maintain composure. I'm the attending on this consult. I need to examine Ms. Brooks first. He flinched as if my words were a physical shove. For a moment, I let the professional arc of my training carry me. Check the vitals, palpate the abdomen, monitor the fetal heartbeat. The little paper strip of the fetal heart was a reliable thing, and when I heard it, a flit of continuity, I felt something in my chest contract and kick back in its own rhythm. This child had not asked to be caught in the middle of adultery and secrecy. The fetus beat like a small drum in the center of an unfolding treason. I moved around the gurney with practiced motions and with a kind of violence that is practiced in long marriages of paper and pretense. I did not let my fingers tremble. I probed, listened, made notes. Her pulse was clinging to the lower edge of normal. Her blood pressure dipped as expected. He explained in halting, guilty bursts that she had fainted in the bathroom, that he had found her at the sink, that they were on their way to urgent care when a neighbor had called an ambulance. The words were neat. The story had a tidy center. It was as if the narrative itself tried to apologize in the way it had been constructed. When he looked at me, there was something like shame, but it was wrapped in pleading. Let me explain, Em. Do you know the sensation of being in the middle of something and watching both sides as if through glass? I watched him speak the way you watch a child misinterpret the rules of a game. A swell of fury rose not only for the betrayal, but for the audacity, for the small cruelties, smiling at a woman whose giggle is not my own, sending flowers that were not for our anniversary, buying furniture that was not discussed, for the convenience with which he had built another world on the side, and for his willingness to return to ours, pretending the two did not touch. But I am a surgeon. My hands have to be trusted, and trust is a brittle thing to wield. I swallowed the animal sound in my throat. If I made a scene, I would be news in 12 hours. My license would become a story. The worst of my bruises are not physical, they are reputational. I was not prepared to be reduced to a momentary spectacle in a place where people's lives hinge on precision and restraint, so I played a role. I kept my voice even warm to the point of familiarity. I guided the nurses, suggested observation, recommended admission. I told them the language they wanted, that Ms. Brooks should be monitored for possible threatened miscarriage given the fainting spell and the emotional trauma. I called for an ultrasound and a head CT for Michael's sighting protocol. A kind of small war was starting, but I told myself it was waged in evidence and paper, not shrieks. When he was wheeled out for imaging, he passed me in the corridor. His eyes latched onto mine like magnets. He looked like a man who had been found out by something he had believed would always be cleverer than the truth. As the gurney passed, I slid a hand into his pocket. I pulled out his phone, not stealing but gathering the way. One collects a shard of broken china for later proof. It was a reckless move, but the necessity of proof can be a kind of moral compass. I pressed the side button, and the lock screen blinked awake. Our wedding photo stared back at me, a small, happy artifact. It was obscene to have it there, like a movie poster in a crime scene. I tried the obvious passwords first. Our anniversary, my birthday, the phone stubbornly refused. Then, almost by an instinct I did not know I had, I tried something I'd seen in chart states, names, apertures. The phone gave a small chime and opened. The messages were a landscape of soft betrayals. They were syrupy and cheap, as if love could be reduced to emojis and gentle nonsense. He called her baby and my light. There were pictures I had never been meant to see. Dinners in restaurants I recognized from magazine pages, hotel keys, vague references to the plan, and keeping it quiet. Then under a folder of images, bank transfers, regular, neat, large sums, flowing a little like blood into her account. I felt like someone watching my life through another person's hands, and suddenly comprehending how much had been siphoned away. What was ours vanished in small transactions. Dinners, rent a deposit for a place with a view of the ocean. The condo we had saved for the small notes we had written to each other in a kitchen lit with the wrong light, all of it shadowed. I sat in the staff lounge with the phone heavy in my palm and let the gravity of the moment press at my lungs. I thought of the quiet nights when Michael would fall asleep and I would watch him breathe, memorizing the planes of his face, like a catechism. I thought of the ways I had compromised and the meetings I had skipped and the research articles I had restructured so we could call this life ours. There are choices that feel like surgical procedures, clean incisions, precise saving what can be saved. There are other choices that scar without stopping. I sat and planched my grief into a blueprint. I could have made a spectacle in the ER, screamed until the walls took sides. That would have been dramatic and immediate and messy. Instead, I drew a line through the hurt and decided the quieter, slower kind of justice suited me better. If I wanted to dismantle him and what he had built, I would do it with documents, with the patience that a patient file demands. I would gather everything: messages, bank records, timelines. I would press each thing between pages until the book made sense. I told myself very strictly that this would not be about vengeance. In the cartoonish way, it would be about closure, about structural correction. I would not become the woman who had lost herself to fury. I would be the woman who had been wronged and then using everything a hospital had taught me. How to collect evidence, how to act with clarity, would take back the boundaries of her life. I walked back into the corridor, where the night had thinned to a cool, clean line, and watched the elevator doors close on the gurney that held my husband. The hospital hummed on around me like a living thing, indifferent and attentive at once. My hands were steady. My face was composed. My chest, however, carried a stone that had been dropped there by the truth. If you have ever felt the floor fall out from under you because of someone you trusted, if you have ever found a lie where you expected the map of your life, then you know what the world does to you in the minutes that follow. It begs you to choose, scream, crumble, or plan. I chose to plan. If you want to know how far I went to gather the truth, if you want to sit with me in the quiet that follows, betrayal, and watch the architecture of a life be remade, subscribe and follow me. Because this is not just a story of hurt, it's a story of watching yourself become someone you almost do not recognize. The hours after Michael's CT scan passed with a strange elasticity, as if time had begun to bend. Round the weight of what I knew, stretching and contracting in unpredictable rhythms. I moved through the hospital with mechanical precision, but beneath the crisp edges of my white coat, my thoughts pressed against each other like shards of glass. I kept replaying the same quiet question. How long had my life been happening behind my back? The ER team stabilized Ashley quickly. Her vitals evened out. Her fainting episode chalked up to a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and emotional shock. They transferred her to a room on the maternity floor, the same wing where I spent half my life, coaxing newborns into their first breath. In another life, I might have felt protective toward a patient in her condition. Now, as I stood at the foot of her bed, reviewing the chart, I felt something colder, an unfolding calculation. The kind that begins when compassion is eclipsed by knowledge. I told myself I was not there to judge. I was there to observe, to catalog, to see. Ashley's lashes fluttered when she stirred. When her eyes opened, they were soft-wide, disoriented. She looked at me like any patient looks at the doctor, standing by their bedside, searching for reassurance. Answers, something simple to cling to. It took a beat too long for recognition to find her, and even then, it was only the faint, harmless kind. "You're the doctor from earlier," she murmured, her voice weak, but unguarded. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Professional, unreadable. It was a familiar mask. I'd worn it for years, long before I knew I'd need it, like armor. "The baby is fine," I told her. "We'll monitor you overnight, but everything looks stable." She exhaled with a small, trembling relief, her hand moving protectively to her stomach. It was a gesture I had seen 1,000 times and could interpret in a dozen ways. But this time, it struck me like something staged rehearsed. My mind protested at the judgment. I knew nothing yet, not truly, but suspicion had a way of rooting itself. After betrayal growing in soil I didn't know was fertile until it sprouted. She asked a few questions about dietary recommendations. She asked if fainting was normal, if stress could hurt the baby, if the ultrasound would show anything else. Her concern was genuine enough on the surface. Yet every time she mentioned Michael, every time his name slipped from her lips, with the ease of a shared routine, something inside me folded in on itself. When she drifted back to sleep, I left the room without a sound, but the tension in my shoulders followed me like a shadow. I needed answers, not the emotional ones, those could wait. The structural ones, the ones that told me what I was standing on and how easily it could collapse. The ones that mapped out the ground I had unknowingly crossed while blindfolded. I returned to the break room, closed the door behind me, and set Michael's phone on the counter. The wedding photo stared back at me, our faces too bright, the moment too perfect. Preserved like a pressed flower that had already lost its scent. I unlocked the phone again and dove deeper this time. The financial records were worse than I had realized. transfers every week, payments labeled with little hearts or inside jokes, bookings for hotels I recognized by skyline views, a rental car charge for a weekend he claimed he had spent in meetings, a $15,000 wire transfer to an account belonging to Ashley Brooks Trust, a trust she should not have at 25, unless wealth had threaded itself through her background. It didn't add up, not with the girl curled in a hospital bed, wearing department store leggings, not with the small silver necklace she wore, the kind found on sale, not handed down from privilege. Unless, of course, the simple exterior was camouflage. The realization didn't sting. It merely cooled the air around me, crystallizing the understanding that this was not a spontaneous love affair born from loneliness or chance. There was intent somewhere in this structure. Intent always leaves fingerprints. When the morning staff began filtering into the lounge for coffee, I tucked the phone back into my coat. No one questioned it. I was the attending on duty, and no one questions a surgeon on a night shift. They assume you know what you're doing, even when you're holding something that could alter the course of your life. I stepped out into the hallway and walked toward the clinical records office. The silence there felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves had been listening. Morning, Dr. Carter, the records clerk, greeted, handing me a stack of charts awaiting review. I need the full file on a patient admitted. Last night, I said. Brooks Ashley, OB/GYN case. He nodded and retrieved the folder. I signed the log and carried it to my office, closing the door with a quiet click. The blinds were half drawn, slicing the sunlight into narrow stripes that lay across my desk like measured intervals. I flipped through the file triage notes, vitals short history. Then my fingers brushed the ultrasound printout. I lifted it to the light, letting the grayscale shadows of early anatomy settle into clarity. The biometric markers told a story no clinical note had articulated. The embryo measured nearly 13 weeks. Ashley had told intake she was about 7. A 6-week discrepancy does not happen accidentally, not when most women track these things down to the day, not when fainting and panic accompany the reveal. I leaned back in my chair, letting the implications wash over me with a slow, controlled burn. If the pregnancy was 13 weeks, then the conception preceded Michael's first trip to San Diego, the one that had marked the beginning of his odd new schedule, his new habits, his new lies. This pregnancy wasn't his. The knowledge didn't bring satisfaction. It wasn't vindication or triumph. It felt like standing in the center of a building. After the gas has already leaked, knowing the explosion was inevitable, and realizing you were now the only one who could choose when the match was struck. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used since my residency. Marcus Hale answered on the second ring, his voice still sharp in the morning. Emily. It's been ages. Everything all right? I need your help, I said, and my own voice sounded foreign to me, calm in a way that only grief or determination can produce. I can be at Pacific Hills in an hour, he offered. No, coffee shop, somewhere quiet. I gave him the name of a cafe near Westwood, the kind of place where people whispered and stared at laptops, as though their thoughts were encryption keys. He didn't ask questions. Marcus never had. He was the kind of man who knew how to wait for details until they were useful. When we sat across from each other later that morning, I slid the ultrasound across the table. He studied it with a furrow between his brows. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked. "It's not his child," I said simply, "and she's pregnant." He exhaled slowly, not surprised Marcus rarely was, but concerned. "What do you need from me?" Everything about her. The dossier he would produce would take a week, but I already knew intuitively, viscerally, that something in Ashley's past would crack this open. People do not build complex lies without practice. They do not step into someone else's marriage without patterns of stepping into other spaces as well. Marcus nodded, slid the ultrasound back to me with quiet precision, and stood. "Consider it done." When I returned to the hospital, a different kind of energy settled around me. It was not anger, not yet. It was clarity. I checked on Ashley before rounds. She woke with a soft groan, blinking sleep out of her eyes. She looked fragile in the sanitized morning light. A woman suspended between worlds, unaware. She was standing at the center of a story that was no longer under her control. Her voice trembled when she asked, "Is everything okay with the baby?" "Yes," I said, because it was the truth, in the only way truth can exist, when layered over a lie. "But you'll need monitoring. I've recommended observation for a few days." She nodded, her relief sinking into the pillows. Michael slipped into the room moments later, his face arranged into something meant to look like concern. But guilt sat crooked beneath it, visible to anyone who knew how guilt shifts the muscles of a face. He touched Ashley's arm with a tenderness that struck me as almost theatrical. "Thank you," he said to me, his voice hushed and earnest. "Really, Em, thank you." The nickname sounded different now, out of place, like a stranger wearing my coat. I stepped out before I said something that would fracture the air. Later, in the quiet of my office, I opened Michael's phone one last time. I copied the messages, the transfers, the photos. I stored them in a secure drive, a folder named after something clinical and unremarkable, something no one would click unless they had a reason. Then I powered the phone down and placed it in a drawer I rarely used. Not hidden, not flaunted, simply waiting, just like I was. The plan was not fully formed yet, but plans, I reminded myself, grow like roots slowly, quietly beneath surfaces that look calm from above. I washed my hands, tied my hair back, and returned to rounds. From the outside, nothing about me had changed. My colleagues saw the same steady surgeon, the same calm presence, the same precise hands. But underneath that silence, something deliberate had begun to take shape. Something patient, something unbreakable. Morning sunlight always had a way of softening the hospital's sharp edges, but on the day Marcus called me back, it only illuminated how starkly the world had divided itself into before and after. I stood at the nursing station reviewing patient charts when my phone vibrated. The message was short. "I have something. Come when you can." There was no urgency in the words, but there was weight, a heaviness that threaded through syllables, pulling them downward. I felt it settle in my chest even before I tucked the phone away. I spent the next hour completing rounds, checking vitals, adjusting medications, reviewing fetal monitors. My face, I imagine, looked exactly how it always did. Focused, composed, ready. But my mind was elsewhere already, rehearsing the possibilities of what Marcus had uncovered. People do terrible things for unremarkable reasons, loneliness, greed, fear, desire. Those motivations don't usually hide well. If Ashley was the center of a deception that predated Michael, then her past would reflect the fractures she tried to plaster over. When I finally stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, I caught my reflection in the chrome doors. I looked like someone who had slept with the light on, someone bracing for the second half of a sentence she already knew would land wrong. The cafe where Marcus waited was a short drive from the hospital, tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat on a quiet Westwood street. Morning traffic hummed with a kind of detached indifference, as though everything in the world continued exactly as it ought to, unaware that someone's life was shifting on unseen axes. Marcus sat at a corner table, a thick folder resting beside his untouched coffee. When he saw me, he stood not out of politeness, but because he recognized the kind of gravity that had walked in with me. I took the seat across from him, the chair legs scraping softly against the tile, the sound somehow louder than it should have been. "I didn't rush," he said quietly, sliding the folder across the table, "but I also didn't sleep much." The folder was heavier than I expected, not physically, just in implication. I didn't open it yet. I waited. "Ashley Brooks," he began, "isn't exactly who she pretends to be." I almost laughed at that, the bitterness rising in the form of something sharp. But I held it back. Silence, I'd discovered, could be stronger than agreement. Marcus continued, his tone steady, clinical in its precision. "Her legal name is Ashley Lawson. She married into the Lawson family when she was 20. Ethan Lawson, son of a construction magnate out of Orange County. Ethan Lawson, a name that carried wealth chained to entitlement. I'd seen the Lawson logo on billboards and construction cranes throughout the city. They divorced just over a year later," Marcus said. "No official misconduct filed, but the settlement was generous, extremely so. She received a payout that would sustain most people comfortably for years." A slow bruise of understanding began to form beneath my sternum. "After the divorce, she didn't finish school," he went on. "Moved apartment to apartment for a while, traveled a lot. Her social media is practically curated photos in high-end restaurants, luxury hotels. But what stands out is the company she kept." He reached into the folder and withdrew a stack of glossy photographs. All taken discreetly, all too telling. Ashley stepping out of a Beverly Hills restaurant with an older man whose name I recognized from real estate newspapers. Ashley getting into a chauffeur-driven car with another man I knew headed a design firm downtown. None of the men appeared in her life for more than a season. I touched the edge of a photo lightly, as though the image might ripple under my fingertips. "Patterns," I murmured. "Yes," Marcus said, "patterns." I leaned back, letting the truth settle. Ashley hadn't fallen into Michael's life accidentally. She had been conditioned by her past, by her habits, by the trajectory she had shaped to seek out the perfect kind of man. One easy to impress, one eager to protect, one vulnerable to the oldest illusion in the world, the promise of belonging. Michael had always been susceptible to that validation disguised as need. He wanted to feel essential, irreplaceable. I used to believe I provided that effortlessly, simply by loving him. How naive that seems in retrospect. Marcus cleared his throat, pulling me from the thought. "There's more." He removed another document a copy of Ashley's intake form from a private women's clinic in Newport Beach. The date printed in the corner sat like an accusation. It was precisely 12 weeks before she fainted in the ER. She came for a routine appointment, he said, early pregnancy confirmation. My pulse tightened. So the conception date. Definitely before Michael entered the picture. For a moment, the cafe noise dimmed. The soft scrape of mugs, the rustle of newspapers, the quiet chatter at nearby tables. All of it faded behind the slow, resonant clarity of the truth. The baby she carried had never been Michael's, not even remotely. The folder's final section contained transaction histories, not Michael's, Ashley's. A dwindling bank balance, high-end expenses credit card debt that contradicted her curated appearance of stability. She was burning through the Lawson settlement, Marcus explained. Fast. I closed the folder. It wasn't the information itself that unnerved me. It was the realization that this truth had existed beneath my feet long before I ever walked into that ER room. I had stepped into a pre-written story without knowing the script. Marcus hesitated before speaking again. Emily, I want you to understand something before you confront any of them. People who live by deception rarely accept exposure quietly, especially when cornered. I'm not confronting anything yet, I said evenly. He studied my face, possibly searching for anger or grief or something recognizable. What he found instead must have been a kind of stillness forged under pressure. I saw it reflected in his eyes, a mirrored understanding that nothing I did from here on would be impulsive. When I left the cafe, the sun was higher, but the world didn't feel lighter. I walked to my car slowly, the folder pressed against my side like a pulse. Every step seemed deliberate, anchored to a growing sense of direction. At the hospital, Ashley's room was quiet. She slept with her face angled toward the window, sunlight threading between the blinds and brushing her cheek. For an instant, an absurd, fleeting instant, I saw her as someone fragile, someone swept up in something larger than herself. But fragility can be a performance, and performances are rehearsed. Her chart rested on the counter. I picked it up, scanning the fetal measurements I knew by memory now. 13 weeks, not 7. The lie stood stark against the clinical facts. I knew better than anyone that pregnancy had a way of distorting truth emotionally, physically, narratively. But this wasn't distortion. It was construction. I gently set the chart down. Later that afternoon, Michael appeared in the hallway outside her room. He tried to smile, but the expression collapsed before it formed fully. Emily. He began, his voice trying too hard. Can we talk? Not here, I said. We stepped into a small consultation room, a space designed for news, good or bad, delivered over the hum of fluorescent lights. He closed the door behind us. For a second, I caught the scent of his cologne, familiar, unwelcome. He looked tired. More accurately, he looked frightened of what I might already know. I'm sorry, he blurted, hands trembling slightly. I should have told you. I should have. You lied, I said quietly, repeatedly. His throat worked. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, but it had happened this way, and every syllable he chose tried to soften that fact, to cushion it in regret instead of responsibility. I listened not because I needed explanations, but because silence reveals more than speech. He insisted that he cared for Ashley, that he had panicked, that he had never meant to hurt me. The words struck me as rehearsed lines from a script, whispered through a door before entering a scene. "What do you want from me, Michael?" I asked finally. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Whatever answer he'd hoped would absolve him dissolved before it reached me. I left him there standing in the shallow space between guilt and denial and returned to my office. The folder from Marcus lay on my desk like a verdict. I opened it again slowly, as though the pages might shift if I moved too fast. A longness settled inside me. Not sadness, not rage. Something quieter, more resolute. The truth was no longer tangled. The outlines were clear. Ashley had found in Michael what she had learned to look for: someone generous enough to give, insecure enough to continue, blind enough not to notice the edges of her story. Michael had found in Ashley what he had been missing: attention, validation, the illusion of being indispensable. And I had found something in both of them too. A reason to stop being passive, a reason to step out of the role of the woman who absorbs and forgives. A reason to listen to the still, sharp voice that had been forming in me since that night in the ER. I closed the folder, slid it into the locked drawer of my desk, and turned the key with a soft final click. There would be consequences. There always are when the truth forces its way out of the dark. But this time, I would not be the one caught unprepared. There is a particular stillness that follows the moment you decide you will no longer be the person someone believed you were. It is not liberation, not immediately. It is more like a recalibration, an internal quieting, a gathering of instruments before the incisions begin. In the days after Marcus handed me the dossier, I found myself living in that stillness. I moved through my routines with deliberate grace, careful to let nothing betray the tectonic shift beneath my composure. The hospital hummed as it always did, monitors beeping, stretchers rolling, nurses trading clipped sentences in the hallway. Patients lived within their fragile stories, oblivious to the storm forming behind my calm expression. I became an expert at the gentle lie of seeming fine. I avoided Michael for 2 days, not out of fear. Fear had long since transformed into something harder, sharper, but out of strategy. He mistook my silence for grief or indecision or shame. Silence is a generous canvas. People paint their own hopes onto it. It didn't occur to him that my quiet might be calculation. On the 3rd morning, I visited Ashley's room with the same unhurried professionalism I used for every patient. She sat propped up against pillows, her skin washed pale by the soft glow of dawn pushing through the blinds. Her hair was brushed now, her clothes fresh. She looked less like a woman who had fainted and more like someone rehearsing how to look fragile. When she smiled at me, it was almost grateful, almost tender. It struck me briefly that she had no idea what she had walked into, no awareness that the person standing at the foot of her bed had become the fulcrum of something she could not yet see. "How are you feeling this morning?" I asked, my tone precise but warm. "A little better," she replied, smoothing a hand across her abdomen. "Still tired, but grateful." I nodded and lifted the chart, though I already knew every number on the page. "Your labs are stable," I said. "The baby's heartbeat is good. Rest is going to help." Her relief was immediate, genuine. It was the first moment I felt the faintest tremor of something like, not sympathy, but recognition. Ashley was a product of her own survival instinct. That didn't absolve her, but it explained her. Still understanding someone is not the same as forgiving them. When I stepped out of the room, Michael was leaning against the wall opposite her door. His tie was crooked, his hair unkempt in a way that looked intentional, as if he had spent too long running his hands through it. In some attempt to summon remorse, he straightened when he saw me. He said, trying for softness. "Can we talk now, please?" I didn't look at him immediately. I let my silence sit, let him feel the discomfort of having to wait for my attention. After a pause, I finally met his eyes. "After my shift," I said. He nodded too quickly, eager to interpret that as hope. I left him there, half relieved, half tormented, and walked back toward the stairwell, feeling the weight of his gaze between my shoulder blades. That evening, I drove home alone. Our house in Brentwood felt unfamiliar when I stepped through the door, as if it had shifted minutely on its axis. I set my keys down on the marble counter we had chosen together during a home renovation that now felt like someone else's memory. The air smelled faintly of the jasmine candle I'd lit 2 nights earlier, though I no longer remembered why. I opened the kitchen drawer where we kept paperwork, warranties, receipts, insurance forms, and found the folder for the Santa Monica condo. The deed, the down payment ledger, the mortgage plan, all the meticulous records of what we once believed would be our future home, the place where we would grow into another version of ourselves. I stared at the papers for a long time. It was remarkable how easily the weight of a life could fit into a manila folder. The next morning, Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway just as I was lacing my shoes. His expression flickered with relief, desperation, and something I could not immediately name. "You didn't come home last night," he said quietly. "I stayed late," I replied. "You could have called." I looked at him, then really looked, and realized what expression I'd misread. It wasn't remorse, it was fear. The fear of losing something he had taken for granted. "Michael," I said, my voice steady, "you wanted to talk." He swallowed, nodded. "Right, yes, just can we sit?" He motioned toward the dining table where we'd once spent mornings laughing over burnt toast and evenings debating which movie to watch. Now the chairs felt more like props. I sat across from him, but kept a deliberate distance. He took a breath that trembled. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was lonely, Em. You were always at the hospital. I thought we wanted the same things, but you were moving forward so fast and I was standing still. Ashley, she paid attention. It was a rehearsed confession, the kind meant to evoke pity. But pity, like trust, has to be earned. And I was finished giving away things for free. "Is that all I asked?" "No," he whispered. "She's pregnant. And I thought that meant something. I thought it was a sign. That maybe I could have the family I always imagined." I let the silence sharpen between us. "Did you love her?" I finally asked. His eyes darted away. "I don't know. A half-truth. Cowardice wrapped in honesty." "I never stopped loving you," he added quickly, sensing the shift in my breathing. Those words used to anchor me. Now they barely registered. "I need time," I said, standing. His face changed with the kind of panic that only appears when someone senses a lifetime beginning to slide out of reach. Emily, please, don't walk away. Not like this." I didn't answer. There are conversations that don't need endings, only exits. The following week, Ashley's condition stabilized enough for discharge. The obstetric team gave her instructions, scheduled follow-up appointments, and reminded her to avoid strenuous activity. She thanked them with the unsure politeness of someone unused to gratitude. Before she left, she asked to speak to me privately. I agreed. She sat on the bed's edge, twisting her hands in her lap. I know this must be strange for you, she said carefully. Us, everything. Her eyes were wide, earnest, almost apologetic. I studied her as one might study a patient whose symptoms were subtle but significant. It's not my place to judge, I replied, but you know about me and Michael. Her voice wavered. He told me you did. He told you that I said, though I wasn't surprised, yes, and I want you to understand I never meant to hurt anyone. It was a lie. Not necessarily malicious, more the type that comes from someone who has spent their life surviving in the spaces between other people's desires. Sometimes I said gently, intent matters less than consequence. She blinked, tears gathering but not falling. I'm scared. About the baby. About everything. I nodded. Fear can make people do complicated things. When she left the hospital later that morning, walking slowly toward the exit with Michael at her side, I watched from a distance. They looked strangely mismatched, he fraying at the edges. She delicate but intact, like something crafted to appear breakable. I followed them with my gaze until they disappeared through the sliding doors. The next step unfolded naturally. 2 days later, I arrived at the Reed family home in Pasadena, carrying a gift bag wrapped in silver tissue paper. Inside was a pearl necklace, elegant, understated. Expensive enough to signify devotion. Linda opened the door with her characteristic brightness, enveloping me in the kind of embrace that made me wonder if she sensed the storm gathering. Emily, sweetheart, she exclaimed. You didn't have to come all the way here. It's your 60th, I said softly. Of course I did. She touched the box reverently, her eyes warming. You're too thoughtful. Michael said he's been swamped with work. I'm so glad you took the time. I followed her inside, noticing the pictures lining the hallway. Michael in graduation robes, our wedding photo, family vacations. Artifacts of a life built with intention, even if that life now sat on the edge of something fractured. As we prepared dinner, Linda asked what she always asked. How are you two doing? The question hovered like a knife over a vein. I could have told her everything in that moment, allowed the truth to spill out and carve its own path. But timing is as important in life as it is in surgery. You don't cut before the tissue is ready. We're managing, I said simply. Linda nodded, satisfied but curious. You'll have children soon, I hope. I've been waiting for that day. I let the weight of her hope linger in the air before I answered. We want that too, I said, lowering my gaze. More than anything. Her expression softened. She didn't press further. That night after dinner, when Michael called Linda, asking questions about the family's property, settlement funds, questions she now repeated only to me. I understood the exact shape of his desperation, and I understood how to use it. Not maliciously, not vindictively, but precisely, with the same controlled intention I reserved for the operating room. By the time I drove home, the decision had settled completely. It wasn't anger that guided me, nor even betrayal. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you realize that the story you've been living in is not the story you will allow to define you. The kind that whispers not loudly, but with unwavering certainty that the time for observation has ended and the time for action has begun. The night the call came, I already felt the tension before my phone lit up. There is a particular silence that preludes catastrophe, the kind that makes the air feel too still, too anticipatory, as if the world is inhaling sharply but has not yet decided when to exhale. I was reviewing charts in the on-call room, sitting beneath the thin fluorescent lights that never fully warmed a room when Michael's name flashed across my screen. I answered on the second ring. "Emily, please." His voice instantly fractured. "Something's wrong with Ashley. She's doubled over. She can't stop screaming. God, I think she's losing consciousness." "Emily, what do I do?" Every syllable vibrated with panic. Real panic, the primal kind that cuts straight through self-preservation. I felt the shift immediately. My professional instincts ignited before my heart had time to react. "What kind of pain?" I asked, already standing. "Where exactly?" Her lower back radiating to her groin. She's sweating. She can't breathe right. She keeps saying it feels like something is tearing inside her. "Emily, I don't know what to do." His voice broke on the last word. Renal colic, severe, accelerating. Everything I had predicted, everything I had quietly watched gather momentum, was unfolding right on schedule. "Bring her to Pacific Hills ER," I said, keeping my voice steady, controlled, calm. "Now." And then I hung up because panic was contagious, but precision never could be. Within 20 minutes, the ER doors burst open with the force of a storm. A gurney rolled in. Ashley curled tightly on her side, her face gray with agony. She clutched her stomach with one hand and the railing with the other, gasping as though the air itself had turned hostile. Michael hovered beside her, frantic eyes shot red hair damp with sweat. "Emily," he breathed when he saw me, as if the sight of me was a lifeline. "Help her, please, please, save them, them." The word struck with a cold echo. The next moments unfolded in swift, well-practiced choreography. Nurses surrounding the gurney monitors, attached fluids started, blood drawn. I stood at the head of the bed, watching Ashley's pain spike with each wave. Her pupils were blown wide, her breaths shallow. When the results arrived, they confirmed what her body had already made painfully clear. A large ureteral stone lodged near the vesicoureteral junction, causing severe hydronephrosis and an infection that had begun to tip into dangerous territory. Sepsis is not a threat, it is a countdown. By morning, she had deteriorated further. Her fever climbed, her blood pressure dropped, and faint red mottling spread along her skin. The fetal heartbeat weakened, then disappeared altogether. First a wobble, then a void. The baby was gone. Michael collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his shaking hands. His sobs weren't clean or controlled. They were jagged, feral, the sound of a man who had lost the last thing tethering him to his imagined future. But even then, beneath the grief, something bitter throbbed, the dawning realization that he had pushed for this outcome. His choices, his obsession, his blindness had shaped the very disaster unfolding before him. When the bleeding began, violent, rapid, unrelenting, the emergency call rang through the maternity floor. Code OB massive hemorrhage or preparation now. I was already halfway down the hallway. Inside the operating room, the air was thick with urgency. The surgical lights blazed overhead, cutting through the chaos. Ashley's body shook on the table, her pallor almost translucent. Machines beeped erratically. The anesthesiologist barked orders. Nurses moved with fluid precision. And then came the pivot point. The uterus was atonic, flaccid, unresponsive, hemorrhaging uncontrollably. Blood pooled faster than we could suction it. Clamps clicked desperately against metal trays. After exhausting every technique, uterotonics massage balloon tamponade. Dr. Alvarez, the attending surgeon, finally spoke the words that marked the boundary between life and death. There's no other option. We need to remove the uterus. He turned to me. Emily, talk to the family. Tell them we need consent immediately. I stripped off my gloves and gown, stepping into the hallway where Michael waited. He paced like a trapped animal. When he saw me, he lunged forward. How is she? His voice cracked. Is my son okay? I met his eyes with the steadiness of a stone in a river's current. The baby didn't survive. The words punched through him. His knees buckled, but he didn't fall. Not yet. And Ashley, he whispered. She is bleeding heavily, I said. We've tried everything. The only way to save her life is to remove her uterus. His face contorted grief, folding into denial. Denial twisting into something ugly. No, he said violently, shaking his head. No, there has to be another way. She wants children. She wants a family. You're a doctor. You fix things, Emily. Fix this. There is nothing left to fix, I said quietly. There is only what we can save. No, this can't. She can't be useless. The word tore through the hallway like a slap. I saw the truth then, not just his desperation, but the core of it. His desire for a child was not paternal longing, it was legacy, ego inheritance. Children to him were not souls, they were proof of masculinity, proof of potency, proof of worth. But he didn't know he was infertile, not yet. I held out the clipboard and pen. You have to sign, I said. If you don't, she dies. He stared down at the form, the legal language, the stark consequence carved in ink. His hand trembled as he reached for the pen. For a moment he hesitated, suspended between horror and responsibility. Then he signed. When I returned to the OR, the surgery proceeded quickly. The source of the hemorrhage was removed. Blood was transfused, organs stabilized, machines hummed. The frantic energy slowly softened into exhausted control. Ashley survived, but she would never carry another child. By the time I left the OR, the sun had risen fully over Los Angeles, casting a warm glow through the east-facing windows, the kind of light that suggested possibility, rebirth, renewal. In a different story, it might have felt symbolic. But in mine, the beauty of the morning only made the truth more grotesque. Something had ended irrevocably. After a few hours of restless sleep, I drove to LAX to pick up the Reeds fresh from a Hawaii vacation I had orchestrated with deliberate precision. Linda stepped off the plane, glowing with sun and ocean air. But the moment she saw my face, the glow cracked. Emily, she asked, her voice trembling. What happened? I didn't have to fake the redness in my eyes or the exhaustion in my posture. Those were real. "It's Michael," I whispered. We sat on a bench near the baggage claim. I recited the story, not the full truth, but the version calibrated to reveal just enough. His infidelity, his lies, the baby, the hospital crisis, the surgery, the loss. By the end, Linda was trembling with rage, grief, and humiliation. Her husband looked 10 years older, staring at the floor, as if trying to make sense of a son he had never truly known. "Take us to them," Linda snapped, "now." When we reached Ashley's room at Pacific Hills, Michael stood at the bedside peeling an apple, trying to act useful, nurturing, good. But his mother's voice hit him like a slap before her hand ever did. The confrontation that followed was inevitable and volcanic. Accusations, tears, screams, and finally, "It's her fault." Ashley cried, pointing at me with wild desperation. "She did this, she wanted this, she planned everything." The room froze. It was time, a moment constructed not from chance, but from truth. The kind of truth that cuts cleanly through accusation. I stepped forward. "Really," I said quietly, "should we discuss what you were hiding long before Michael ever touched you?" Michael's head snapped toward me. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out the folder Marcus had given me and placed it on the bed. Then I removed a single lab report, the semen analysis I had done in secret. "Michael," I said, my voice almost gentle, "you're infertile." Silence, heavy, crushing, absolute. He stared at the report as if the letters were written in fire. Then, "That's a lie," he shouted. "You forged this, you're jealous, you—" "Test yourself," I said. "Downstairs, right now. If I'm lying, I'll leave." His entire body went still. Before he could answer, the door swung open again, and a sharply dressed young man stepped inside. Confident, arrogant, untouched by the emotional carnage in the room. Ashley's ex-husband. Her real ex-husband. "What are you doing here?" Ashley gasped. He smirked, crossed his arms, and looked at Michael with perfect disdain. "Came to check on my kid," he said casually. "Or what used to be my kid." Linda staggered. Michael turned white. "You two really don't know," the man said, laughing. "She lied to both of us. I paid her off and she still found herself another wallet." Ashley sobbed, shaking uncontrollably. Michael's expression twisted into something feral, betrayal layered with humiliation, rage, and the sudden collapse of every illusion he had built. He snapped. He lunged. Seconds later, security hauled him away as he thrashed and cursed, the hallway echoing with violence. Heartbreak and the ruin of two people who had spent months believing they were in control. In the middle of the chaos, I felt something inside me settle. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just clarity. The story had reached its breaking point, and everything that would follow, all of it, was long overdue. What followed was less an ending than the slow unwinding of a life. When the hospital finally quieted after the violent spiral in Ashley's room, the halls felt bruised, as if they'd absorbed every scream, accusation, and confession. Even the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, as if refusing to illuminate what had just taken place. Michael was dragged out by security, half mad with humiliation and grief. Ashley was sedated, her vitals stabilizing under the constant hum of machines. Linda had nearly collapsed twice. Her husband had to hold her upright as they tried to make sense of what had become of their son. The ex-husband left as abruptly as he'd arrived, bored and triumphant in equal measure. But I felt none of the shock that rattled the others. There was only the sharp, clear stillness of inevitability. You can't watch a building crack from the foundation and still be surprised when it finally collapses. I didn't go back into Ashley's room. I didn't seek out Michael. I didn't offer condolences to the Reeds. My role in that chapter had ended, and once the truth had detonated, there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to orchestrate. The truth had its own gravity now, and everyone else was being dragged by it. I returned to my office and closed the door, the soft click sounding like a final stitch pulled tight. The next morning came too quickly. My shift started at 6:10 a.m., but I didn't sleep more than an hour. My mind replayed every moment in vivid detail, the signatures on the consent form, the scream Ashley let out before the sedation took hold, the wild look in Michael's eyes when he realized the child he'd built his delusion around was not his, had never been his. When I walked into the hospital cafeteria at dawn, nurses murmured in small groups, casting quick, heavy glances in my direction. The story had spread overnight, altered, exaggerated, embellished. But the core remained. I was the doctor who saved the mistress's life. I was the wife who discovered her husband's betrayal in an operating room. I was the woman who watched the man who betrayed her unravel in public. None of them knew the truth beneath the truth. By mid-morning, the hospital administration called me into a private meeting. The board chair, Dr. Herrera, sat across from me, with a posture stiff enough to fracture. "Emily," she began, "we reviewed your handling of the case." I waited. "You remained professional under extraordinary personal circumstances." A pause. "You saved the patient's life, and you did not compromise care." Another pause. "You have our respect." She dismissed me gently, almost reverently. I walked out of the office with a quiet sense of closure. I hadn't lost my career. I hadn't lost my credibility. If anything, I had emerged sharper steeled by the fire of a crisis that could have destroyed me. The divorce was the natural next step. Marcus served as my attorney, and from the moment we filed the petition, the process moved with swift momentum. We brought everything, every transfer receipt, every text message, every falsified document. Michael had shown Ashley the screenshots of their conversations, the high-dollar transactions to her private accounts, the evidence of the condo he'd moved her into without my knowledge. We presented the semen analysis too, not because I needed revenge, but because the truth mattered. Infidelity, financial misconduct, emotional abuse, deception, misappropriation of marital assets. The judge didn't deliberate long. She ruled that given the severity of Michael's actions, the entirety of our joint assets, including the Santa Monica condo, the Brentwood house, and the investment accounts, were to be awarded to me. Michael left the courtroom with his pockets turned inside out. He didn't meet my eyes as he walked out of the courthouse. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. The man who once stood so tall had shriveled beneath the weight of his own decisions. He looked small. Weeks passed before the next twist. I had already begun cleaning out the Santa Monica condo, the one that had once been our future, but had instead become the stage for his betrayal. I didn't keep a single item that belonged to them. The walls felt tainted, the air stale with the memory of someone else's fantasy. I called a realtor the next morning and listed the property. It sold faster than I expected. Ashley wasn't doing well. After the hysterectomy, after losing Michael, after the exposure from the ex-husband's outburst, her mental state deteriorated quickly. Her family checked her into a psychiatric facility in Orange County. When I heard, I felt that familiar stillness again, a quiet acceptance, neither triumph nor pity. The world has a way of balancing itself even if the process is violent. Michael found out about Ashley's breakdown at the same time he received notice of his termination from his company. A sexual scandal coupled with public violence and professional misconduct wasn't something a corporate board would tolerate. He lost everything: salary, reputation, colleagues, status. There were rumors he'd moved into a cheap apartment downtown, the kind with buzzing neon signs and cracked windows, the kind far from the life he and I once built. I didn't follow up. The past had become a closed room. A month later, the call came from HR. The chief of the OB/GYN department was retiring. They wanted me to take the position. At 35, it made me one of the youngest department heads at Pacific Hills. When Dr. Herrera handed me the contract, she said softly, "Everything you went through and how you handled it proves you're ready for this." I signed, not because I wanted power, but because I wanted direction, stability, a life defined on my terms. The first morning I stepped into the department head's office, sunlight streamed through the windows with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. I sat down at the desk, exhaled, and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't touched since all of this began: peace. Not loud, triumphant peace. Quiet, steady peace. But peace never lasts long, not when ghosts still roam in the periphery. It was a Tuesday evening when it happened. I had just finished a 14-hour shift. My scrubs still smelled faintly of antiseptic. My head throbbed from lack of sleep. As I walked out of the hospital into the fading golden light, I saw a figure standing by the entrance: Michael. He looked nothing like the man I married. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes hollow, his skin sunken with fatigue. He stepped forward cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. "Emily," he said barely above a whisper, "please, don't walk away." Not yet. I didn't move. He dropped to his knees, right there on the concrete in front of staff members, patients, security guards, the entire evening crowd flowing past the entrance. "Emily," he begged, grabbing the edge of my coat. "I lost everything. I know I did this. I know I ruined us. But please, I don't know who I am without you. I'm begging you. Please, give me another chance." His voice cracked so hard it almost sounded like something breaking inside him. But whatever remained between us had already dissolved long before this moment. I stepped back from his grip, carefully, cleanly, as though removing a scalpel from a wound without tearing the tissue. He stared up at me with wet, desperate eyes. "Michael," I said quietly, holding his gaze with the same steady calm I used in the OR, "You need to get up." He didn't move, so I added the only thing left to say. "Get up," I repeated, "and let me go." The words seemed to drop through him like stones sinking in water. I turned and walked toward my car without looking back. His voice rose behind me, pleading, calling my name, but the wind carried it away before it reached me. By the time I reached the Pacific Coast Highway, the sky had opened into brilliant blue. The ocean shimmered. I rolled down the windows and let the wind rush in, lifting the hair from my face. At a quiet overlook, I pulled over and sat for a long moment, watching the horizon. The world felt wider than it had in months, open, unstained, waiting. I reached into my purse and pulled out the final envelope I had kept since the divorce. The results of the STD panel, all negative, a clean break in every sense. I smiled, not the forced, brittle smile I had worn for months, but something softer, real, whole. I tore the envelope into pieces and let the fragments scatter into the ocean breeze, each one caught by the updraft, each fragment drifting farther from the woman I had been. When I finally drove away, the road unwound before me like a promise. A new life, one defined not by betrayal or vengeance or loss, but by choice, my choice. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.